Good evening. Good afternoon, actually. Welcome to this edition of our Sunday sermons. We are pleased to have the members from the Church of Christ at Bagdad to join us, and also any others, brother, brethren, or friends or family, who are able to join us for this period of study. We are presenting this to you, recorded earlier, but for that time period of our Sunday afternoon 3 p.m. service. And we hope that you've been able to access the other sermons that have been placed on the YouTube channel as well. Wanted to remind everyone that you can and should, if you have opportunity, put some comments on the YouTube channel comments section. Things about the lesson, comments, insights, criticisms, whatever you might want to put there. And I'll see those and be able to respond back to you. This afternoon we're going to continue with a process we put in place several months ago of studying a book at a time, beginning with Genesis and working our way through each book, not in the great detail you would study if you were doing it for a class, but looking instead at the overall view of the letter or the book and what it's about, some of the main points, and especially how they relate to us here in the New Testament times. We are looking this afternoon at the book of Ecclesiastes, another of those writings of King Solomon. We talked a little bit last week, about the Proverbs. We finished up our study, actually, of the Proverbs, and there's a difference. The Proverbs are more like practical sayings that Solomon gained by his great wisdom as he experienced the ups and downs of life as king of Israel, and how he put into small, short, but very powerful statements many of those lessons that he learned, like the difference between wise and foolish people, how the wise listens to instruction but the foolish disdains it. Some things like that are pretty obvious to us, but the way that Solomon says them helps us to put them into our mind. This letter or book here is called Ecclesiastes, and the name itself refers to one who stands before an assembly. Therefore, it sometimes is referred to as the preacher. So here this afternoon we have a preacher preaching to you about the preacher. Solomon was indeed a preacher. He put forth these lessons, and we're going to see from our study this afternoon that it is the lessons which he himself learned that he applies to us and himself as well. Ecclesiastes, the preacher, we know that Solomon was revered by many as a wise and very sage person. Much of his wisdom, of course, was because of the great gift that God gave him. He was the wisest man to ever live. But some of the practical applications of his wisdom came about by Solomon's efforts to answer a couple of questions. And he tells us what those things are. In the first verse of Ecclesiastes chapter 1, we're told that Solomon is indeed the author of this book or letter. Verse 1 simply tells us the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Only one could fit that. That would be King Solomon. Also in verse 12 of that first chapter, I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. So he identifies himself as the author here. Then Solomon tells us what his purpose is, if you will. What is the thrust of this whole writing that he's doing here? And we believe it would be described like this. He is describing for us his search for meaning in life. What is the meaning of life? That's a big question. And everybody has, I'm sure, either thought about it or asked it of themselves at some point. At some point it leads us to asking about God and looking in his word for those answers. And Solomon's going to give us some things that are found in God's word as the inspired writing of Ecclesiastes here, but also things that were developed by Solomon as he experienced the things that could possibly have meaning in life. In the first chapter, but the third verse, Solomon sort of states his purpose here. He says, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? Yeah, what profit is there, Solomon says. He assumes that we understand his intention here. He says people work all the time. To what end? To what purpose? What profit does a man have? Also in that first chapter, at verse 13, he puts it this way, and I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. This burdensome task God has given to the sons of men, by which they may be exercised. All right, Solomon puts it clearly. He wants to seek and search out the wisdom that is under heaven. Under all those things that man deemed to be important, what is it that's really important? And he says, quite accurately, it is a burdensome task. Solomon went about it energetically, but it was also something that was a burden. He was striving to come to a conclusion for us and for himself. As we enter our study here, think about the way that this search of his is framed. His search pertains to life under the sun. Now, if you go back to chapter 1 and verse 3 again, what profit does a man have, he says, in all his labor, in which he toils under the sun? He's not talking about eternal life yet, but he's talking about life from mostly a worldly point of view. If you go out and do your job, if you go out and make your living, if you go out and do those things which are expected of you, then what is the meaning of that? I suppose every preacher tries to accomplish some insight into this. We try to get our audience to understand that there's a meaning to our lives now and a meaning to the future, the hope of eternal life, a meaning which goes beyond this one. And Solomon will eventually reach that conclusion, we believe. But as we study further, some of his message is a little bit on the negative side, because a major theme that keeps coming up in his description of things here, it's used about 35 times in these 29 verses here. He says that there is vanity of life. Vanity, the word actually means emptiness. We'll see what he says about it here in the first chapter, second verse this time. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Okay, you've established that, Solomon. Everything's vanity. Verse 14 of that first chapter also tells us, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping for the wind. So there's a picture we can see. Grasping for the wind. Have you ever tried to catch the wind? I've ridden down the highway with my arm sticking out the window sometimes, and I can feel the wind having some impact on my arm, my hand, but I can't catch it. I'm not able to grasp and hold the wind. It's not possible. And yet he says that's kind of what life is like, he says, trying to reach for and hold or to grasp the wind. So, if it's that important for us to understand what he means by vanity, let's go a little further with him. He mentions some good things. He mentions words like joy, enjoy, enjoyment, rejoicing, joyfully. Solomon is not completely negative. As we'll see, there are things that he brings up which do indeed point towards some joy in the life that we live. As he goes on with this idea of the preacher, he begins to expand on the vanity of life, and he talks about it from his experience. In the second chapter, and we're going to be going kind of chronologically through these chapters a little bit, verse by verse for some of them. Let's just take a look at how he describes the vanity of life. And as we're doing this, think about it from your standpoint. Do you and I believe that life is indeed vain or empty? Are we just spinning our wheels here? Like we studied in the earlier lesson for this morning, are we just drifting? Are we not making any forward progress? Second chapter, verse 1. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this also was vanity. Well, pleasure may be important. Many people today seek pleasure. That's their goal, to do whatever makes me feel good, whatever makes me happy, to the detriment of anybody else and what they think. The vanity of pleasure. And notice that what he says was, I said, I will test you. This is a test. Solomon says, I know how to achieve pleasure. And believe me, Solomon had the resources to do it too. He was rich beyond imagination. He had contacts throughout the world. He had places he could go, things he could do that would boggle your mind and mine certainly. The vanity of pleasure, though, is what he ends up. He says, this also was vanity. In verse 11, he begins a shift of gears. He talks about the vanity of labor. Verse 11, he writes this, then I looked on all the work that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled. And indeed, all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. Well, how's that, Solomon? You mean you worked all this labor you put into amassing your kingdom's wealth, and it's not worth anything to you? You and me, we work our fingers to the bone, we say sometimes. And for what purpose? Isn't it to gain something from it? And yet Solomon says here, I looked at all the works that my hands had done, and the labor. He worked and toiled. Yes, Solomon worked. And he says, what about it? It was vanity and grasping for the wind. In that same chapter 2, go down to verse 22, and he says, for what has man for all his labor, and for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, and his work burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity, the emptiness of work without reward. Oh yeah, we might get some slight reward. How about a paycheck to pay our bills or to feed our family? But in the big picture, the labor that we do, what kind of recompense do we get for it? He says, what has man accomplished? All his days are sorrowful. There's not much that he can be happy about. In fact, you turn over to chapter 4 and verse 4. He continues this train of thought. He says, again I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. It's weird how we envy each other in the toil that we're engaged in. I see my neighbor working hard, and I think, man, he's really making progress. He must be getting a great reward for all that he does. And he may be thinking the same thing about me. In other words, we both are probably not profiting anything, and yet we view that as labor that's to be envied somehow. Yeah. What about making yourself wise? Solomon was wise, and he sought to become even wiser. In the second chapter, at verse 15, he deals a little bit with how this was brought about. Chapter 2, verse 15. So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity. And you think about that, will you? Solomon benefited from God's great gift of wisdom. More wise than any had ever been and any that would ever come along, the wisest person ever. And Solomon says, I know that I've got something good here. He even says in verse 13 of that chapter 2 that wisdom excels folly. He wasn't a fool. Nobody's fool was Solomon. And yet he says, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. The person who behaves foolishly is probably going to end up just about like me. In some ways, we're going to suffer the same end of our life. We're going to end up returning to dust. And later on he makes that point. But he talks here about how vain human wisdom is. Does that apply to us? Would we strive to gain more and more knowledge and wisdom and be at the pinnacle of the highest thinkers of the world? Solomon says, forget it. That's going to be nothing but vanity as well. He also, in chapter 2, verse 17, tries to look at the big picture. You know, he says, maybe I've been concentrating on details too much. And so he says, therefore, I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me. For all is vanity and grasping for the wind. All of life, he says, all of life ends up the same way, and he toils only for emptiness. All of life. What about the value of what you leave behind? Oh, now he's thinking, well, maybe the value in all this labor and experience is not in the present. Maybe it's something for the future. So in chapter 2, beginning in verse 18, he says, then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled, and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. All this, he says, is vanity also. Continuing on there, verse 20, therefore I turned my heart, and despaired of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. Poor Solomon. He says, I understand now, even in the future, there's not much benefit to hard work. If I work hard and amass things and value and get equity in my wealth and all that, he says, I'm going to die, and some other guy is going to get it who didn't work for it. I'll leave it as an inheritance, maybe to my children, and if they didn't work for it, they won't appreciate it. And he says, even if they're fools, they'll still have it. And he says, I turned my heart. I despised all my labor that I'd gone and done. And he says, this not only is vanity, but it's a great evil. How's that? I think he knows the impact that inheritance sometimes has on the receiver of it. Those who are beneficiaries of great inheritances often end up going into all kinds of evil and despair because they're not equipped to handle it. Solomon continued to search for life's meaning, and he came up with some observations. We just looked at things that he tried to investigate, and here are his observations after he checked it all out. Chapter 3, let's take a look at verse 19. For what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them. As one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men, which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal, which goes down to the earth? Solomon tells us some pretty important stuff here. He says, in the first place, that your earthly existence is really no more than some animal. Well, wait a minute. Yes, in the earthly sense. He says it happens to one just like the other. If one dies, so does the other. And when they die, they both go to some place. The bodily part returns to the dust, he says. And the spirit of the sons of men goes upward where God is. But the spirit of the animal goes down to the earth, just like the fleshly part. In other words, he's telling us animals don't have that extended spiritual existence that we do. Ours does flow upward, and that existence continues, but animals don't have it. That when they're over with, they're over with, and returning to the dust, to the earth, is the same for them physically and spiritually. But look at what he says. He says, as far as life itself is concerned, it's vain because I can work as hard as I want to, and my puppy dog can lay there and enjoy restful peace all of his life, and when it's all said and done, we both die. And the body that we thought so much of goes back to the dust. And so he's just looking there at life itself. And we'll talk about the spiritual part in just a moment. He also talks about the vanity of acquiring riches over your family, paying attention to physical things and not family. Chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. Then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is a vanity and a grave misfortune. He talks here about a single person who has no family, and he acquires these great riches, but he never comes up with an answer to the question, who am I working for? Why do I deprive myself of good to work hard when now that I leave, there's not going to be anything left for me? It's kind of like that previous thought, that whatever you have will be left to somebody else. But Solomon makes it a good food for thought for ourselves. If we have a family, wouldn't it be better to acquire the riches that we need to survive, but also pay attention to that family, to not be letting all this acquiring of riches take the place of acquiring good relationships with our family? Solomon also observed the vanity of political popularity. Verse 16. And I don't know if Solomon had political aspirations or not. He didn't really have to. He was king. But he says, there was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. Yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Yeah, you can be a popular leader. You might be a king whom the people revere. But then he says, when you're gone, nobody's going to care. Well, in his case, it's not really true. We read his writings here. We know about King Solomon. We think highly of him. But what's he saying? Well, politics, the idea of gaining popularity with the masses of people. He says there was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. There were multitudes. But what happens at the end, he says, those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. They'll follow somebody else. And the next point there too, the vanity of many dreams and many words, chapter 5 and at verse 7. He says, for in the multitude of dreams and many words there is also vanity, but fear God. Yeah, even the aspirations, the dreams that we have, the hopes and aspirations for the future, and the many words that we might come up with. Hey, Solomon was a man of many words. He wrote the Proverbs, he wrote the Ecclesiastes. We're going to study later Song of Solomon, which is attributed to him. Those are mighty fine words that he writes. But what happened? Solomon died, and we remember his work by reading it, but really that's not much to go by. Is he famous because of that? Not really, because later on he turned away from God, and he's not famous for that. Many words and many dreams, he says, are also vanity. There in chapter 5 at verse 10, he who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. Now Solomon had observed this. I'm sure he had seen it in himself and in other people too, that those who have never seem to have enough. And if you have silver, that's great, that's good, but it won't be satisfying for long. The same way with anything in abundance. If your crops grow and produce lots of good stuff, that's great, but you'll be wanting more. You'll be like the farmer in Luke chapter 12 who built bigger barns and bigger barns to store up his stuff and still wasn't satisfied. It's vanity, he says. If you love abundance, then you hope to achieve it. Sure, you want your crops to exceed what you expect, but he says be careful. It's not the end. It won't be enough. And it will end up being a vanity for you. You'll be empty there. You won't find success in it. And in chapter 6 and verse 2, he says here, there is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men. That's verse 1. Verse 2, a man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires. Yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity, and it is an evil affliction. Well, here Solomon had all the wealth that could possibly be. Even people from other parts of the world, like the Queen of Sheba, came to visit him and view his great wealth. But Solomon didn't get to enjoy it, really. At the end of his life, was he more joyful over his great abundance than without it? Not really. It didn't provide any lasting joy for him. In fact, he lays that same title on it. He said, this is vanity, and even worse, it's an evil affliction, where those who work hard to establish a kingdom like his, and what does he say there? A foreigner consumes it. He may be thinking about the foreigners like Jeroboam, who came in and took away a large part of his kingdom, or those rulers on down the line who took it away. The preacher's observations also include just some, sort of like the Proverbs, a few practical things. Over in chapter 7 and at verse 6, he tells us about the vanity of foolish laughter. Now, we all love to laugh. Laughing is good for you. It's therapeutic, people say. But listen to what he says here, chapter 6. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. What's he getting at there? Well, if you want to heat up a pot of water, you don't want to use thorns. They burn fast and quick, and there's not much heat energy in them. They're going to be gone quickly, and they won't impart any heat to what you're trying to warm up. If you want something that will last, then you'd want to get some oak wood or some hickory, something with some substance to it, so that when it burns it releases lots of energy. But what's he saying this? He says this here is a crackling of thorns under a pot, the laughter of the fool. If we're foolish, we may find humor in something that doesn't have the basis for it, and that's dangerous today, especially in our world of social media. You may post something that you find extremely funny and humorous to yourself, but you may offend a lot of people, and it may indeed be nothing of substance to you. It may indeed be just a crackling thorn fire, but you're going to cause some things to happen. Chapter 8 and verse 14, he tells us here, there is a vanity which occurs on earth, that there are just men, to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Again, there are wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I said also, this is vanity. It's injustice. When the righteous live a good life and then something bad happens to them, that's not right. That's not just. When the wicked live that way and then, in some manner they benefit, they find something good happening to them, just as you'd expect for a righteous person to have, all of that, he says, is vanity, this injustice that we recognize in the world around us. So the meaning of life is not in whether you get rewarded for what you've done or not. That's probably not going to be the way you measure it. In chapter 11 and at verse 8, but if a man lives many years and rejoices in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. All that is coming is vanity. Well, the days of darkness, he says, not everything is happy and merry and bright. There are days of darkness, days of despair and confusion and things that don't turn out our way. And what does he say about those days? There'll be many. Yes, they will. And all that is coming, he says, is vanity. Well, if you live many years and rejoice in them all, that's great. But be aware that some won't be, and that vanity of the days of darkness is also something to consider. He also tells us in chapter 11 and verse 10, therefore remove sorrow from your heart, and put away evil from your flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. Yeah, we understand that. Older folks, as we become senior citizens, we start to really understand that old proverb that we have that says youth is wasted on the young. They don't know how to appreciate it. The vanity of childhood and youth, the emptiness of having all that blessing and then not realizing how good it is until it's gone, until you've passed on through that part of your life. He says childhood and youth are of vanity and emptiness. So, take a few more here. There are several that your scriptures indicate. We go back to chapter 6, and at verse 9, there's another one here. The vanity of wandering desire. Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. I think it relates to sticking with what you can see rather than what you hope for. Wandering desire is kind of lustful. You look at things that are not yours to have or not attainable and think that that's the greatest that could ever be, when really the less vain part of it is the things that we can actually see, the sight of the eyes, better than wandering desire. The vanity of foolish laughter, like we talked about there in chapter 7 and verse 6 just a little while ago, when he said the laughter of a fool is like that, and the vanity of injustice in this life. I think I duplicated a couple of those. Let me get on to the next screen here. Here we go. Now, let's talk about the joy that he found. The preacher's experience is not that everything is vain, not that everything is filled with vanity in life, but there are some things that are joyful. Solomon mentions that his heart rejoiced in his labor back in chapter 2 and verse 10. Listen to what he says there. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? Chapter 2 and verse 10. Here we go. Wrong verse. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor. this was my reward from all my labor. Yeah, there you are. Solomon says, I did all that I could to find this elusive pleasure thing, and my heart rejoiced in all my labor. I was happy to be doing it. I've seen people who love to work. Seen people who it seems as though that work just brings them immense joy. That's his reward, he says. I gained joy from all that labor that I engaged in. The reward of his labor was really the joy in doing it. Did you notice that? My heart rejoiced in all my labor. It doesn't mention what comes from it. He doesn't say that I rejoiced because I got good things from my labor. He says I rejoiced at the doing of that labor. That's something we might want to think about. I've known people like that. My wife's dad was a man who worked hard all of his life, and he could sit down and enjoy some rest and a glass of tea for sure. But he was happiest, I think, when he was working hard. He used to work in the feed store, and I remember seeing early on how he would grab some feed sacks, couple under each arm, and march off down the aisle to deliver them, and a big smile beaming on his face. He was glad to be doing it, glad to be of service, glad to be earning his way. And so maybe that's how Solomon felt. Solomon also observed that there are some things that are simple, and you should enjoy them. Chapter 2 again, verse 24. He says, nothing is better for a man that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy the good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. He doesn't label this vanity. Nothing is better, he says, than to enjoy the simple things that you have done. These things that you have done to bring yourself food and drink, and that you should enjoy your labor. In chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, he says, for who can eat or who can have enjoyment more than I? Solomon says, I'm a guy who likes to eat. I enjoy it. And I get some enjoyment from that. It's enjoying what you have and what you do that you know it comes from God. Chapter 2 and verse 26, just following right on down there. For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This is also vanity and grasping for the wind. It's another kind of injustice there, where God gives a man joy in the knowledge and insight that he gains if he's good, but then that same verse tells us that the wicked may acquire many things, but it's going to be eventually given to somebody else. And there lies the vanity, he says. They work and they get stuff, but it's going to someone else. Over in chapter 3 and verse 12, I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. What is he saying there? What man should look for is this ability to rejoice and do good. Wait a minute. Doesn't the scripture say somewhere it's better to mourn than to be joyful? Better to visit the day of death than the day of beginning? Yeah, there's some thought to that. But Solomon here is just telling us there's nothing wrong and nothing inherently bad about rejoicing at the good in your life. He would do that. That's what Solomon would impart to us, a lesson like that. More observations come along. He says every man should enjoy the good in their labor, which is indeed a gift from God. We read that just a moment ago from verse 13 of chapter 3. That every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift from God. Do we ever think of that? That God is the source of these good things in our lives? And the joy in one's work is his heritage, not what may happen after he is gone. What does that mean? Look at verse 22. So I perceived that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? The work we do is what we should be remembered for, not the things we accumulate. Yeah. And after we're gone, it doesn't matter. We're not going to change anything. We will have done our part. We will have done whatever work we're going to do. And the preacher here observes that that is our heritage. Move over to chapter 5. And starting at verse 18, he expands more. Here's what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink, and to enjoy the good of all his labor, in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives to him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart. How much pain and suffering could be eliminated if we did that? If we looked at the gift of God in how he gives us the ability to labor and to enjoy the results of it. That's a gift from God, and that is our heritage, not whether we have a bunch of stuff or a high value of things to give away later. Chapter 7, verse 14, he writes this, "In the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider. Surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him." You know what he says there? God is the source of both prosperity and adversity. We should rejoice in the prosperity that we have, in the build-up of good things in our lives. But he also says that if we have adversity, that's the time to contemplate. To sit down and think about it. What have I got here? What's this going to do to me? And realize that I may be able to learn from even adversity and turn it back into prosperity at some point. He commands us to enjoy the fruit of our labor. Chapter 8, verse 15. "So I commended enjoyment, because a man has nothing better under the